Montana Territory, September 1879. The first gunshot split the morning, air like thunder over Pine Ridge. By the time the second echoed across the valley, Rosalie Hayes was already running barefoot through the wilderness. Her wedding dress torn to ribbons, blood streaking her shoulder where thorns had clawed at her flesh. She never looked back. The forest north of her father's homestead stretched thick with Douglas fir and quaking aspen, the earth soft beneath, her feet with fallen needles and moss. She ran until her chest burned, until the angry shouts behind her were swallowed by the green silence. Her veil had been ripped away hours ago. Her corset hung loose, the laces severed by her own trembling. Hands in desperate haste. She had refused to marry the man they'd chosen for her. A man her father had promised her to with nothing more than a handshake in the town square. Marcus Donovan, the judge's 40-year-old son, with a face carved from granite and fists that matched his temperament. They promised he would provide her security. What they meant was he would cage her like a songbird in a gilded prison. But Rose had not been born to sing quietly in the shadows. She stumbled through the dense undergrowth as darkness crept in, and when her legs finally gave out, she crawled on hands and knees. Her body trembled with cold and terror, but still she pressed forward. Her mind drifted to her mother's weathered headstone, to the last genuine embrace she'd ever known, and then to the stranger with gentle eyes who had helped her with her horse 2 weeks earlier at McKinnon's General Store. He had tipped his hat politely and said, "You dropped this, miss." She hadn't dropped it. She had left it there on purpose. His name was Daniel Reed Cowboy, soft-spoken, broad-shouldered, with hands that spoke of honest labor. He had looked directly at her, not through her as most men did, and something deep in her chest had awakened. Now she prayed to whatever merciful God might be listening that she could find him again by dawn. Her feet were raw and bleeding, her once white dress blackened with mud and torn beyond recognition. She had followed Miller's Creek eastward, just as old Pete the trapper had once told her. The creek runs east, and east runs to the open range where you'll find the cattle trails, he'd said with a knowing wink. She was ready to collapse when she spotted smoke curling above the tree line. She crawled the final 100 yards, sobbing with exhaustion and desperation, every muscle in her body screaming for mercy. And then she saw it, a modest cabin built of hewn logs, a chestnut mare tethered out front, and a man stepping onto the porch with a rifle in his weathered hands. He stared at her, frozen in place, as she gasped out, "Please, Dot." Before the world dissolved into darkness, when consciousness returned, she found herself in a bed softer than any she had known. Her shoulder was carefully bandaged, her feet wrapped in cloth. A fire crackled peacefully nearby, and a hand stitched quilt was tucked beneath her chin. He sat in the corner chair, hat resting in his lap, watching her with quiet concern. "You ran," he said simply. She managed a weak nod. "You were hurt." "Just tired," she whispered, though they both knew it was far more than exhaustion. He rose and walked to her bedside, pouring water from a clay pitcher into a tin cup. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he passed it to her, and for the first time in days, she didn't instinctively flinch away from a man's touch. "I have to go back," she said weakly. "No," he replied firmly. "You don't. Your father isn't here." She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "They'll come searching for me." He nodded once. "Let them come. I won't let anyone take you against your will." Something inside her broke open then. She began to cry deep, wrenching sobs that came from the very center of her being, and he simply let her. He sat beside the bed, not touching, just present. "You don't even know." "Not me," she said when the tears finally subsided. "I know you ran through the wilderness alone and bleeding," he replied quietly. "That tells me everything I need to know." She turned her face toward the dancing flames. "He would have destroyed me. I believe you." She looked back at him with surprise. "Why are you showing me such kindness?" He stared into the fire for a long moment. "Because no one showed kindness to my sister when she needed it most." They sat in comfortable silence after that. The wind whispered through the pines. Outside, a hawk cried overhead. She drifted back to sleep. By the third day, she could walk again, still barefoot, but steady on her feet. Daniel had given her one of his old cotton shirts and a pair of canvas trousers cinched at the waist with rope. She helped him tend the horses in the morning and split kindling until her arms ached, and he made her rest while he prepared their simple meals. "Do you think they'll find this place?" she asked, watching him saddle his mar. "Your father's men?" She nodded. He shrugged. "Perhaps, but this land doesn't belong to him." A comfortable silence stretched between them. "You don't talk much," she observed. "Never saw much purpose in it. But you talk to me." He looked at her then, his voice low and sincere. "Because I want to." That evening she sat on the porch steps while he smoked his pipe by the fence rail. The stars blazed so brilliantly they seemed to pierce her soul. "I was meant to marry Marcus Donovan," she said into the darkness. "I figured as much." He said, "He would tame me." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "You're not a wild horse, Rose." She turned to look at him in surprise. He was studying the star-filled sky. "You're not meant to be broken." She stood and walked to where he leaned against the fence. Her hand barely grazed his sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered. He turned to face her fully. "You don't owe me gratitude." Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "I owe you everything." "No," he said gently. "You're free now. What happens next is entirely your choice." She stood so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I want to stay," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. "Then stay." A week passed, then 2. They settled into quiet, steady rhythms, her healing, him working the land. She learned to ride bareback on his gentle Mari. He taught her to handle a rifle with confidence. She cooked over the wood stove and hummed old songs when she thought. He wasn't listening, but he always was. She caught him watching her once while she hung laundry on the line, and her heart stumbled in her chest. She didn't look away. Neither did he. That night after supper, he reached across their small table and placed his rough hand over her delicate one. "Rose," he said slowly, carefully, "I don't want to speak out of turn." "Then don't," she whispered. He froze. She leaned closer. "Say it plain." He swallowed hard. "I want to marry you." Her breath caught in her throat. "I know it's sudden," he continued, "and you've endured more than I can ever fully understand. But I would treat you with respect and tenderness. I would never raise my hand to you, never try to cage your spirit. I would simply be your husband, if you'll have me." Tears filled her eyes, but they were different tears now, tears of joy, of hope, of unexpected love. "I do want that," she said. "You do?" She laughed through her tears. "Yes, Daniel, I do." They were married in town 3 days later beneath the ancient cottonwood tree behind the small church. No guests attended save the elderly preacher and a prairie wind. She wore a simple blue dress, and he wore his Sunday shirt. He held her hand throughout the entire ceremony. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Daniel looked to her for permission. She nodded once, and he kissed her like he meant it and like he meant everything. She had been meant for another man, but she had escaped through the woods to find her true destiny. And now she was his wife, and he was her chosen husband, the first. Frost arrived early that year. By late October, the wind carried a sharp bite that cut through even the thickest wool, and the sky turned pewter gray just after sunset. Daniel had begun rising before dawn to split extra pine, and Rose had taken to boiling the wash water indoors to keep it from freezing before she could use it. They had been married 3 weeks. The rhythm of their days had settled into something. quiet yet profoundly full. She stitched new curtains from calico fabric she discovered tucked behind a crate of nails in the barn. He rebuilt the chicken coop using salvaged boards from an old freight container. They rarely spoke while working, but when conversation came, the words flowed as naturally as if they'd been talking to each other for years instead of days. One afternoon, with the sun hanging low and the scent of fresh-cut cedar still clinging to his coat, Daniel leaned against the fence post while she shelled beans on the porch steps. "My mother used to sit just like that," he said, not quite looking at her directly. Rose paused, her fingers stilling over the wooden bowl. "Do you speak of her often?" "No." She waited patiently. "She died the spring I turned 16. Fever took her quickly. By the time we could get help, she was already gone. My father ... he wasn't much good after that." Daniel's voice carried the slow weight of someone excavating something buried too deep for too long. "I'm sorry you lost her so young," Rose said, not softly, but steadily, the way she would want someone to speak to her if their roles were reversed. Daniel rubbed the brim of his hat between his palms. "She used to sing to the milk cows. Not well, but with her whole heart. I remember that more than anything else about her." Rose smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I can't carry a tune either, but I hum when I'm nervous. I've noticed." She glanced up, cheeks flushing pink. He straightened, eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary, then cleared his throat. "Do you miss town life? The noise? Having other women to talk with?" "No," she said without hesitation. "I prefer the quiet." He nodded once and returned to his work. That night, as the fire burned low and wind traced along the chimney stones, she stood brushing out her long hair near the window. Daniel sat by the hearth, carving a button from a scrap of antler. The soft scraping of his knife was the only sound between them until she spoke. "I never told you what I brought with me when I ran." He looked up expectantly. "I left with nothing but the dress on my back, but I had hidden my mother's cameo in my boot. I couldn't bear to leave it behind." She crossed to their small table and opened the drawer. From beneath a folded handkerchief, she drew out a delicate silver locket, shaped like an oval, the edges worn smooth with age. She wore it every Sunday. "When I was small, I used to press it into my palm like a talisman." He rose and came to her side, studying the precious heirloom. "You're fortunate you kept it safe. I think it kept me safe." He traced a finger along the locket's edge, then looked at her with something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. "You're stronger than most men I've known," she said quietly. "I've had reasons to be." She didn't ask what those reasons were. The first snow arrived 2 days later. It fell heavy and wet, clinging to branches and accumulating along the cabin's eaves. They worked together to seal the window edges with tar and lay down fresh straw in the barn. Nights grew longer, and the space between their hearts grew smaller. One morning she woke to find him sitting at the edge of their shared bed, already dressed, boots laced tight. "Do you hear that?" he asked quietly. She sat up, listening intently. Hoofbeats more than one horse. Approaching fast, he reached for the rifle leaning against the doorframe, his jaw set with grim determination. "Stay inside," he said. "I'm not hiding anymore," she replied firmly. He turned, eyes sharp with concern. "If these are men sent to take you back, I'll send them away. But I need to know you're protected behind me." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Only if you promise not to shoot unless you absolutely must." He gave a curt nod. She stepped back, heart pounding like a war drum. 2 riders materialized from the tree line by the time Daniel reached the porch. Both wore wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the cold trail, dust still coating their heavy coats. "We're looking for a woman," the older rider called out without dismounting. Small build, brown hair. She might be traveling with a man. Daniel didn't move from his position on the porch. Haven't seen anyone pass this way recently. You certain? She ran off from her family. Might be in some kind of trouble. She's not here, Daniel said firmly. The younger rider shifted restlessly in his saddle. We have a name. Rosalie Hayes. Know her? Daniel's voice remained perfectly even. I don't take kindly to men hunting women like they're wild game. The older man's eyes narrowed dangerously. We're not hunting anybody, friend. We're trying to make things right. Daniel stepped down from the porch. Then you'll understand when I tell you she's not yours to find. A long, tense silence stretched between them. The older man finally touched the brim of his hat. If you see her, tell her father's offering complete forgiveness. Daniel made no reply. The riders turned their horses and departed without another word. When he came back inside, Rose stood holding her breath by the window. You heard everything? He asked. She nodded. They won't return. How can you be certain? Because I saw the fear in that older man's eyes. Men like that don't come back once they realize someone's willing to stand between them and what they believe they own. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I didn't think I'd ever feel truly safe again. Daniel set the rifle aside and reached for her hands. You don't have to think that way anymore. She closed the remaining space between them, pressing her forehead against his chest. Outside, snow continued drifting down, soft and untroubled by human conflict. Inside, their silence was no longer empty. It was full of promise. Late November brought winds that moved low through the valley, brushing across snowdrifts like invisible hands across fresh linen. Rose had taken to mending by the window where natural light lingered longest. Daniel carved fence posts in the barn, though the ground was too frozen to set them properly. There was comfort in purposeful motion, even when it served no immediate need. One morning she discovered him at the table sorting through a stack of old letters bound with string. He offered no explanation, and she didn't pry until she noticed the return address printed in precise handwriting. Fort Benton, Montana. Territory. You've kept these a long while, she observed, brushing her fingers across the aged paper. They're from a friend, he said without looking up. Served with the 7th Cavalry. Rode regularly until 76. Stopped after the campaign ended. Was he lost in battle? No, he stayed back east, married a girl from Philadelphia, took up school teaching. Said he didn't want to carry a rifle again unless it was for hunting food. She turned one letter over in her hands, noting the careful script. Did you serve with him? I was too young for military service, but I worked at the fort mucking stalls, repairing equipment, hauling water for the horses. Heard all the war. Stories, secondhand. Never wanted to live one myself. She set the letters down gently. You miss him. I miss the way he listened. Never talked like he knew everything. Just ask questions until you figured things out for yourself. Rose watched him tuck the letters back into a metal box and slide it beneath the floorboards by the hearth. I could write to him for you, she offered. If you'd like. He considered this for a long moment. Maybe come spring. She nodded UNDERSTANDINGLY. Later that week, they rode out to check the trap lines a mile north, where the creek curved around the ridge and evergreens grew thick enough to break the worst winds. Rose had taken to riding his buckskin mare, a sure-footed animal with a gentle mouth. They bundled in layers, her woolen scarf wrapped tight against the bitter air. A red fox had triggered one of the baited snares, but the others hung empty and undisturbed while Daniel reset the spring mechanism. Rose crouched nearby, brushing frost from a patch of pale lichen growing on a fallen log. My mother used to boil this with pine bark for coughs, she said. Tasted like dirt mixed with tree sap. He glanced over. Did it actually help? Not that I could tell, but she swore by it. She pulled off one glove and pressed her bare palm against the frozen ground. I think I remember her hands better than her face. Now, Daniel stood, brushing snow from his knees. What were they like? Calloused from hard work. Always smelled like dill and wood smoke. She kept a sliver of lye soap in her apron pocket, even when we had nothing else of value. They rode back in comfortable silence. That night she pulled their quilt closer around the bed and whispered, "I want to plant dill in the spring garden." He reached for her hand beneath the heavy covers and squeezed gently. "We will." Spring's thaw came slowly that year, seeping into the earth's bones like a carefully guarded secret. By mid-March, snow had loosened its iron grip on the fields, and patches of brown grass showed through in the hollows where wind had scraped the white banks bare. Sap began running in the maples again. The air carried faint scents of wet bark and wood ash. Rose stood at the paddock's edge, sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the lingering chill, her skirt hem darkened with mud from melted snow. She leaned against the fence rail, watching Daniel work patiently with the bay gelding he'd acquired through trade 2 weeks prior. The horse had nervous energy, but Daniel moved with clockwork patience, his hands steady and sure. "I've never seen a horse flinch like that and still accept the bit," she observed. He glanced at her briefly. "He carries memories of being struck. You can feel it in the way he startles." She studied the gelding's flickering ears. "Will you keep him?" "I aim to give him reasons to trust again." She didn't respond immediately, but later when she brought out a bucket of oats, she let the gelding smell her palms thoroughly before moving closer. He didn't shy away. As days lengthened, Rose began measuring time by her garden's progress. She cleared the southern plot with a spade, turning soil with her back and shoulders until sweat ran down her spine. Daniel built a low rail fence around the space, not to keep animals out, but to mark the boundary of what they were creating together. One afternoon, while she knelt planting dill beside early onions, she heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Daniel stepped carefully between the garden rows, wiping his hands on a cloth rag. "I encountered a boy from town this morning," he said. She looked up expectantly. "He brought word from the sheriff." A fire consumed the Donovan house down to its stone foundation. Her hands stilled in the rich, dark earth. Was anyone hurt? Building was empty. Marcus headed south with whatever money he could gather. Disappeared. Completely. She sat back on her heels, processing this news. So it's truly over. It's been over since the day you walked into these woods, Rose. She dusted soil from her palms, not meeting his steady gaze. "I don't feel sorry for him." "You don't have to." Her hand found his on the fence rail. He didn't pull away. That evening, they climbed the ridge above their cabin, where pines thinned and wild. Grass grew in tufts between granite outcroppings. The wind carried spring's coolness, but had lost winter's cruel bite. She leaned comfortably into his side as they surveyed the valley spreading below. "Would you ever want children?" she asked, not turning her head. He drew a slow breath before answering. "If you wanted them, I think I might grow to welcome the idea. I'd like to raise them here," she said. "Let them learn what it means to build something with their own hands. And never teach them to fear their own voices," he added firmly. "No," she agreed. "Never that." They stood together in companionable silence, the kind that needed no words to fill it. Below them, the creek shimmered with day's last light, winding its way through land that was slowly, surely becoming theirs through choice and commitment. When they returned to the cabin, she lit the lamp and poured fresh water into the wash basin. He stepped behind her, arms encircling her waist, his chin resting just above her shoulder. She leaned back into his solid warmth, eyes drifting closed. "I never thought I'd feel this," she murmured. "What's that?" "Like the future could actually belong to me." He kissed the crown of her head, voice low and certain. "It always did. You just had to walk far enough through the darkness to find it." She turned then, hands drifting up to touch his collar. He kissed her slowly, like he was no longer afraid of time or tomorrow or the possibility of loss. The first warm rains of April drew steam from the soil and painted the hills a deeper green than winter had allowed. Rose stood beneath the sloped overhang of the barn roof, palms extended to catch the gentle drops. The scent of wet wood and warming earth filled her lungs, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a meadowlark called out its liquid song. By mid-May, trees had leafed out fully, and the fields began holding color in long, sweeping waves. Rose planted marigolds and chamomile beside the cabin, both for their sweet fragrance and the bees they would attract. She'd bartered for a wooden hive box with a traveling tinsmith bound for Deer Lodge, and Daniel built her a sturdy stand with hands that now moved with the familiar rhythm of shared domestic life. One evening, while she was stripping dried mint leaves for tea, she paused with a piece of linen in her hands. "I've been thinking about teaching," she said. Daniel looked up from his workbench, where he was shaping a new latch for the barn door. "What kind of teaching?" "Reading, writing, basic arithmetic. I met a mother with 3 young children last month when I rode to Miller's grist mill. She said they hadn't seen a proper teacher since before the war ended." He leaned back, considering this carefully. "You'd ride out there regularly?" "Only if you'd ride with me." He nodded slowly. "We could take the wagon once a week. Make a full day of it." She smiled, her heart lifting with purpose. "I think I'd truly enjoy that." They began the teaching visits in early June. Their wagon creaked under the weight of slate boards, chalk sticks, and a wooden crate of second-hand readers Rose had traded preserved fruit for. The children came barefoot and wide-eyed, some barely whispering at first. Overwhelmed by this unexpected gift of education, she taught them beneath a massive cottonwood tree, using the wagon side as a makeshift chalkboard. Daniel sat nearby, sometimes mending leather tack, sometimes whittling, always listening to the gentle rhythm of learning taking place. One afternoon, after the children had scattered home like dandelion seeds, and the sun hung low behind rolling hills, Rose sat beside her husband on the wagon's tailgate. "I never imagined this life," she said with wonder. "Which part?" "All of it," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "I thought I'd be buried alive in a marriage I never chose. I never dreamed I'd be teaching letters beside a man who listens more than he speaks." He let his thumb trace gentle patterns across her knuckles. "I never thought I'd have a home built from something other than blood obligation and family duty." They sat long after the light faded to purple, and when they finally returned to their cabin, they lay together with windows open wide, the air warm enough to carry pine scent and honeysuckle through their small bedroom. By late August, the garden had produced more than they could reasonably consume. Rose lined their shelves with mason jars filled with pickled beans, corn relish, and whole tomatoes preserved in their own juice. The beehive yielded enough honey to fill 2 ceramic crocks. Daniel began cutting timber for a second structure. Storage shed, he claimed, though they both knew it would serve greater purposes. One morning, she stood in the doorway watching him plane rough boards smooth. He glanced up, recognizing something significant in her expression. "You have something important on your mind," he said. "I might," she replied carefully, "but I wanted to be absolutely certain first." He set down his woodworking plane and came to face her directly. "I'm late," she said softly, her eyes steady and unafraid. He blinked once, then lifted both hands to rest gently on her arms. "How long?" 7 weeks. His grip remained tender, never tightening. He simply exhaled slowly and nodded with quiet acceptance. "Are you worried?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "Just thinking about how to build the finest cradle money can't buy." She laughed, her breath catching with joy and relief. "You'll make it better than anything store-bought. I'll make it strong enough to last for generations," he promised. That night they sat beside their fire, her hand resting protectively over her still flat belly, his arm curved around her shoulders. The warmth between them wasn't new, but it had grown deeper, stronger, put down roots that would not easily break. Their life together was no longer something they had stumbled into by chance. It was something they shaped deliberately, day by day, with patience and care and unwavering commitment to each other's happiness. When the first frost returned that autumn, it found them prepared and unafraid. The new shed stood completed, with a cast-iron stove in one corner and built-in shelves along the walls. Rose had already begun conducting lessons there when weather grew harsh. The children arrived wrapped in wool shawls and knitted caps, and Daniel had constructed a bench long, enough to seat them all comfortably. They slept each night in the same bed, their hands finding each other without conscious thought. They spoke less now before sleep came, not from any distance between them, but from the deep knowing that comes with true partnership. Their silences were no longer edged with uncertainty. They were full and rich, like the space between heartbeats as winter settled over their valley once more, and the stove glowed warmly through the darkest hours. Rose reached for Daniel's hand beneath their shared quilt. "We did it," she whispered into the peaceful darkness. He turned to face her, eyes soft with contentment. "We're still doing it, every single day." She smiled. "I'm so grateful I found the courage to run." He kissed her temple with infinite tenderness. "I'm grateful you ran straight to me." And in the quiet, with snow beginning to drift again outside their sturdy walls, they lay together not as two people who had merely escaped something terrible, but as two souls who had built something beautiful and lasting that would endure. Life created not from the ashes of the past, but from the solid ground beneath their feet, the honest work of their hands, and the steady, unbreakable rhythm of love that had taken deep root and would never break.